Ever since beginning this hobby, I've had one persistent goal that I'm sure a lot of you may also have. I've always wanted a fully painted army. This dream started when I was 10 with the Middle-earth strategy battle game. I actually had a fully painted elf army back then, but it was very small. Not the typical point total you'd play a game at, so I never really felt like the real deal, if that makes sense. In the world of 40K, I tried my hand with some space orcs when I was 14 or 15, but I didn't really understand how list building worked, so my army was never really legal, and even then, there were incomplete parts. In the present day, I'm flirting with Dark Eldar, but that army is even further from completion. Next up, I tried out the Empire faction from Warhammer Fantasy Battles. Sadly, I sold most of the cool, unique Middenheim models, and this is all I'm left with. I painted up the Middenheim faction, and again, I got pretty close to finishing my army, but was never really fully done. While invested in Warhammer Fantasy Battle, I also tried out a Wood Elf army that I, again, got pretty close to finishing, but never really fully completed. Which brings us lastly to Age of Sigmar. I did that whole escalation campaign thing sometime last year. I'm happy to report that we are fully finished with the campaign, and I am one measly 10-man unit from finishing my full 2,000 point list of Soulblight Gravelords. Now that's striking distance. Let's finish it up. The last unit in my army to paint up is a 10-man unit of Graveguard, and because I love vampires, I figured this unit would be a good opportunity for a 3D printed proxy unit of heavily armored vampire infantry. Sort of like Blood Knights, but on foot. There are a lot of vampire infantry STLs, and I painstakingly looked through all of them to find a design that would meld well with GW's design language, but was also one that I liked. Highland Miniatures Vampire Neophytes were almost perfect. They felt a bit too chonky and statically posed. Not everyone needs to be leaping through the air, but some variety is good. I also tried out Heroes Infinite, but the models were closer to true scale versus GW's more heroic scale models, so it wouldn't fit so well. The one that I ended up choosing was Last Sword's Vampire Halberdiers. These sculpts do have adequate depth of detail and also meld well with GW's kits, but they were pretty far from easy to use. These models have some terrible supports that look like auto supports to me. They failed on me multiple times while using exposure times for my resin that I've known to work in the past. After multiple attempts, I said screw it and redid all the supports for all 10 models myself. With the prints now working, I started to work on scale. I printed a couple different scales to figure out what size would look good alongside my GW figures. I want them to be bigger than my skeletons, but not as big as modern vampire characters. About 102% seemed to be the sweet spot. One last thing I wanted to sort out was my resin. At the moment, the only resin I'm really comfortable printing with is a high detail, brittle resin that is terrible for gaming models. Considering this is going to be a unit of halberdier wielding models with thin, easily breakable parts, I wanted to invest my painting time into a resin that I knew would stand up to gamer wear and tear. I picked this hero resin, which is significantly more flexible, but was fairly challenging to work with. After adjusting my support tips and dialing in my exposure, I eventually got it working, however. With the supports, scale, and resin nailed down, we can actually print out this whole unit, which reveals the second way in which I paid to get these STLs to work for me. The model is pretty much perfect, except for the huge feathered plumage on top of the helmet. Luckily for me, Last Sword makes alternate helmet options, but for some reason, the vampire infantry models don't come with removable heads. I'll have to do it the good old-fashioned way. With a variety of tools, I clipped, shaved, sanded, and scraped off those old heads and a lot of the surrounding armor detail on the replacement heads. Sometimes I'd have to add some green stuff to fill in gaps or recreate the neck entirely, but by the end of the process, I got good enough at removing just the right amount of material, leaving behind a suitable neck stump to use.
Nailed it!
I did attempt to use some GW heads, both old and new, which I showed off on my painting livestream, linked down in the description. They go live every Tuesday at 1 p.m. CST. The old pewter Blood Knight heads seemed way too massive, and the new heads seemed too tall and thin. That's all for the preparatory stages, and we're about to get into painting. But before we do that, let's hear a briefer from this video's sponsor. Our hobby requires a lot of stuff: paints, knives, brushes, glue, and models themselves. Our sponsor this week, Frontier Wargaming, has an organizational solution that should help with all of this gear collecting dust on top of our messy hobby desks. Exhibit A. Frontier Wargaming's portable and tabletop paint stations allow you to stay organized whether you're at home or on the go. Each solution is fully modular, and best of all, they have 2 standardized tray sizes so you can swap around the various modules until it works best for you. If one day you need more paints than tools, all you gotta do is change around the trays and you're good to go. The trays themselves come in a bunch of different styles, ones that can hold aerosol cans, dedicated magnetic miniature trays, trays that hold not only painting handles but the models attached to them as well, slotted trays for paint pots or dropper bottles, trays that hold paint tubes, and little containers with dividers and lids for your tools and sharps. They even got a wet palette designed to fit inside the paint case. The trays, like the paint stations themselves, are made from 5mm thick stained and laser cut plywood, resulting in a product that is sturdy and lightweight. This makes it easy to simply pack up one of the portable paint stations and go, like I do when I'm off to a convention. They can even make a great in-home paint station if you don't have space for a more dedicated setup. As if all of this customization wasn't enough, in addition to all of this now, you can completely customize your options even further with different building materials and colors, custom painted designs, laser engravings, customizable storage options, and more. You can find links to this custom storage solution and all previously mentioned products in the description below. Thank you to Frontier Wargaming for sponsoring this portion of today's episode. With the models all cleaned up and assembled, it's now time for some paint. As is tradition, I started with some black primer and followed that up with a coat of Scale 75 dark blue from my airbrush. Just like with my previously painted skeletons, video linked in the description and also in the top right hand corner of the screen, the majority of these guys will have a nice red to blue gradient, and to achieve this, I'm using a new red paint from a range called Ultra Acryl. You thought Pro Acryl was best? Forget about it. I'm still waiting for
Omega Omni Hyper Krill.
I'm trying to only target specifically the armor, but a little overspray is okay. Next, I did the cream cloth base coats, also with the airbrush, and now you might see why I chose dark blue as a base coat. Blue is a great universal shadow for most colors, so we can build on top of it nicely. The barely yellow cream color has a more sickly greenish midtone, and the red turns a deep, dark, cold red, all thanks to the airbrush applying thin paint filters over that blue. Again, a little overspray here is okay. We'll have opportunities to fix these mistakes in the future with our normal paint plan steps. Next up, I applied some base coats to my metallics, and I tackled this in a few different ways. For the details separate from the main body, like the head of the halberdier, I applied a base coat with my airbrush because I got no overspray anywhere, and it was way faster than applying 2 coats of paint with a normal paintbrush. For the chainmail, originally I was trying to get a fully opaque base coat, but it was super annoying to get into all those nooks and crannies, so I instead did an overbrush with silver paint on top of my mostly blue paint, and that was significantly faster. I also tossed in a fun copper color to break up the silver for more ornamental parts of the model's armor and weapons. I cleaned up the border of the chainmail and other parts with that same color we base coated from before. This border detail was nice because it allowed me to use overbrushing without messing up either the fabric or the red armor. Lastly, I painted the weapon strapping and other parts a desaturated mid-brightness blue because I was trying to nail the bluish color that occurred when airbrushing their cloth parts. This part was too central to the models. I wasn't able to airbrush it without getting way too much overspray on the red armor. So I'm shooting for a color that looks similar to that airbrushed cloth now, and I'll highlight it to look more like cloth later on in the paint plan. Hopefully that idea works out, as it looks a little funky right now. With the majority of my base coats locked in, it's time to seal this all in with a high gloss varnish. It's fun to see how the red color changes with just a change in finish. Looks totally different. I'm going to be attempting panel lining with an oil wash, but different from my prior attempts in the past. Previously, I've done my oil washes a little thicker, which definitely has its place. This time, however, I really just want a nice defining line running around all my details. I don't want any oil muddying my red if possible. So I thinned it down pretty substantially with mineral spirits. The thinner the mixture, the better the capillary action of the wash, within reason. As someone who is very unfamiliar with oil washes, it's hard to know if what I'm seeing on the model is the best oil washes can do. I don't know what dilution is best for this, so I'm going to adjust it both up and down. The more thinner you add, the better the wash works, but the less opaque it becomes. The thicker the wash, the more opaque, but the less it wants to slide into all those lovely details this model has. Small adjustments to find the perfect amount of dilution was necessary. Eventually, I dialed it in, and I'm not keeping track of a specific ratio. I'm looking for a behavior, what the oil wash would look like in an optimal world, and I discovered that by messing around. Understanding how something is supposed to operate is a way better guide than knowing a ratio, because ratios change for myriad reasons. With this type of knowledge, you can make any oil paint with any thinner and any environment with any model work reasonably well without blindly trusting some magical number. If you're wondering, this is also true for acrylic paint. As a litmus test, I use some Tamiya panel liner for comparison, as I find this stuff to be really amazing for my exact use case here on this model, albeit the wrong color. Speaking of, I'm using Payne's Gray oil paint, which is actually really similar to Abyssal Blue from scale of 75, which works perfectly with my blue shading already going on the Mini. When comparing my oil wash to the Tamiya panel liner result, I actually liked my mixed oil wash more. So I know that if I'm happy with the panel liner, I should be happy with the oil wash as well. Hopefully that gives you some insight into how to solve your own problems instead of relying on content creators like myself. Not a great YouTube strategy, perhaps, long term, but I'd rather educate the next Slayer Sword winner than make a bunch of bad videos that keep people around. I had a few areas that I wanted to clean up, and I used a little makeup sponge, but I found that it was too soft and squishy, and I was losing all of my thin lines. I switched to a Tamiya Q-tip that's much harder, and this allowed me to sponge up the oil paint only on the surface without losing the color in the recesses. In fact, I wasn't using mineral spirits at all to clean this up, and despite varnishing the model and giving them a full weekend to dry and cure, I was still wiping up red paint, as you can see here. Again, I'm not using mineral spirits here, and these models have been varnished and sufficiently cured. In my case, most of the damage comes not from the solvent, but the abrasion of cleaning off the oil paint. When I did need mineral spirits, which I mostly tried out for testing's sake, I applied it to a paper towel first and then rolled my Q-tip in the wet spot to deposit the tiniest amount of liquid, which worked pretty well. After all is said and done, I'm pretty dang happy with the level of detail I was able to achieve with this oil wash, and it took me maybe an hour to apply it and clean it up to the whole squad. There are definitely areas where an oil wash falls short, with the shallower details, for instance, on the chest and thighs, but I chose to avoid these areas with an oil wash because if I just apply a highlight to them, that'll define them enough. At least I hope. Let's find out. Before applying any highlights, let's get back to a nice matte finish. I started with an airbrush solution, but got a little bit of frosting, so I switched to an aerosol option. I applied it right over that frosting, which disguised it for me. I'm not sure if that's always the best way to deal with frosting from varnish, but your mileage may vary. A matte surface is nice to paintbrush on because the microtexture on the surface helps paint to stick down better instead of smearing around. And also, I don't want my final models to be glossy anyways. Applying gloss varnish was purely a utilitarian step. Now on to the most difficult and most essential step, which I'm calling variable layering. Ooh! Here's our model currently. The red armor, despite each part undergoing the same steps, looks different across the model. Sometimes this happens intentionally, like mostly here, but sometimes it can happen unintentionally. It's good to know how to deal with it when this happens, either way. If you were to apply the same highlight across the model, you'd have either very dull highlights on the bright parts of the model, or highlights that are far too bright on the dark parts. We need to treat each part of this model especially, and there are a few ways to do that. If you're lazy like me, you can simply use one highlight color and dilute it to different amounts. The thinner stuff you can use on the darker parts, which will dry more dim, and the thicker and more opaque stuff can be used on the brighter portions of the model. Alternatively, you can use a darker intermediate color to lift up those shaded areas before sparingly adding your brighter and more saturated color like I'm doing here on these hip plates. This method is definitely easier, although it requires mixing or getting out a secondary paint. It's worth noting that I'm not using this darker color everywhere. I'm only using it on the parts of the model that require it, like the larger parts that are visible. On larger areas of transitioning color, like the armor on the back of the model, it can be hard to highlight the Mini without the newly added color sticking out like a sore thumb or covering a very small part of the model. Because of this, I tried to wet blend these areas with bright saturated color and a darker red paint that was similar to what was already on the model. This allowed me to increase the size of the large bright highlight and blend it into the pre-existing airbrush surface more convincingly. If you need help with wet blending, check out this video linked in the top right-hand corner of the screen and also in the description. Reminder, it's often required to apply multiple layers of the same exact wet blend to build up opacity and also smoothness. This is also the step where we are cleaning up our overspray mistakes, like I mentioned previously. I love it when a diagnostic step like cleaning up a mistake can be combined with something I need to do anyways. The last thing I'll say about this step is to not fret the small stuff. There is a ton of sharp little grooves and peaks on this guy's armor, typical of most vampiric concepts. I'm not trying to hit every single edge and preserve every single recessed detail either. If there's some highlight on top of his forearm and hand and it vaguely matches the detail, that's good enough for my tabletop miniatures. I call this variable layering because a normal paint plan might say at this point, layer with ultracryl red, but that would be grossly misrepresenting what's going on. Yes, I'm mostly layering using the same color all over the model, but how I apply it changes wildly based on a number of aforementioned factors. Moving on to highlighting the metallics, the same methodology is applied. I dry brush the chainmail, stipple highlights on the halberd, and more cautiously apply highlights to the belt buckle and other similar details. 3 different scenarios with 3 different applications that make sense for them individually. I should have definitely waited to base coat the blue trim around the chainmail until after this step, if you're curious. While working out metallic highlights, I also decided to base coat the jaw copper as well. This broke up all the red on the model better, but also highlights an important vampiric motif, their teeth. Also, just looks cool. To further break up the red armor, I added blue stripes to the torso of my vampires. Some got 1 middle stripe, others got 2 side stripes, and some even got no stripes. I like to think that maybe it's a designator of rank, perhaps. I applied this same idea, variable layering yet again to the cloth, but I don't think it was really needed. Maybe in some areas to clean up some airbrush speckling, but for the most part, the fabric was good enough. It can be hard to determine how much work to put into individual components of a paint job, but the more the model is painted, the clearer that decision becomes. It was, however, necessary on the bandaging of the weapons because of where I left them last. Now you can see how after a highlight, both the cloth and the bandaging kind of look like the same color despite starting from different places. Only a couple of details separate me from a fully painted Age of Sigmar army, and most notably of those details is a nice, big, juicy, free-handed banner. With some basic highlighting laid down with the airbrush, I started my design with a stencil. This is a big banner, and I could spend a very long time filling the whole space with some cool, awesome design, but I instead wanted to save some time and added a checkerboard pattern to about 1/3 of it. The stencil was far from perfect, and I didn't get the best adhesion to my curved surface, so I had to do some cleanup with a paintbrush, but this wasn't too difficult and was surprisingly satisfying. After that, I started to plot out my design. I added more detail to my chalice by adding in some red color, and with the main design kind of figured out, I started to add some defining lines. With that work done, now it's basically a miniature for me to paint, and I can apply my standard highlighting and shading knowledge to this design. If you're familiar with miniature painting, the hard part of freehand, at least according to me, is really getting to this point. If you need help with the process, I've made another video that deep dives into freehanding that I've linked in the top right corner of the screen and also in the description. To fill out some of the space on the large banner, I added 2 opposing blood droplets to either side of the chalice because, you know, vampires and stuff. With the banner completed and other details coming to a close, this moment was captured live on stream. We are literally 1 base rim away from a fully completed Age of Sigmar army for Scott the Miniature Maniac. The first one I have ever personally owned. Let's do it. Here it goes. The dream I had as a kid is finally complete. Let's see the whole army come together. here are my Chalice Guard. There are some of you out there that might see this accomplishment as a little trivial, or you might wonder how I've gone this long without a fully painted army as someone who's been in this hobby for over 20 years. There are many avenues in this hobby for one to spend their time on. Army painting was my interest when I was a 10-year-old, and is probably the main focus of most people who get into the hobby of miniature painting. When I really sunk my teeth into the hobby as a young adult, and pretty much up until this point, however, I've focused primarily on developing my display model skills, getting good at painting one mini at a time. This allows me to get cool characters, but when it comes to painting a unit of dudes or even an army, I really struggle. It really is a skill to be able to paint armies. There's wisdom in knowing how much effort to put into the models so they look good on the tabletop, but you're not wasting your time and also your energy on efforts that aren't visible. There's the need for endurance in being able to stick with a project for potentially a really long time, or to grind through batch painting. There's a skill in being able to have a scheme, but still freestyle within that scheme and have your newly added units mesh with your existing army, but still feel cool and unique. And probably other skills that I have yet to discover. While painting my Soulblight Gravelords, I've been racking my brain on how to better approach this idea of army painting. There's still so much to learn for me, and as I get more and more into wargaming, the need for fully painted armies and also squads increases. Rest assured, this won't be the last fully painted army you see me paint, and I'm happy to check another game off the list in the meantime. If you want to see any videos about the painting process of this army, I'll link a playlist for your perusal. This has been an ongoing project for 3 years on my channel. This army has seen kit bashing, freehanding, overcomplicated batch painting, and more. In the future, I'll be releasing a video showing off all the armies of people in the Escalation League, asking them questions about the experience, showing off their finished armies or not finished armies, and more. Be on the lookout for that. That's gonna do it for this video, guys. If you like the channel and you wanna support it, there are a number of ways to do that. You can support the sponsor of this video, Frontier Wargaming. You can also support me on Patreon, which gets you access to a Discord server where we chat about all kinds of miniature painting topics, such as how to rank Jordan Peele's horror movies. You can also support me by buying things like merch and also tools off of my web store, like this sick black and red tie-dye hoodie with this nice little bat pocket design, and also a big design on the back. You can also buy things like my cutting mat, which is double-sided with Imperial on one side and metric on the other. It's 3 mil thick, so it's nice and chonky, and it's also pretty big as well. You can buy my miniature, the Duchess, the masterclass course teaches you how to paint the Duchess, and other things as well. Subscribe and die! And most importantly, don't forget to paint my minis!